Welcome. We've got an excellent video for you today. We're going to look at a hypothetical corporate travel scenario. We're going to use that to look at a practical example of how to implement Delta Mesh architecture. And we're going to do it all as a deep dive on Microsoft Fabric. So as part of it, we'll cover looking at the Amadeus travel API. And we'll be syncing information to our Delta Mesh domain. And we'll also be syncing to and from Salesforce.com, and we'll be presenting and looking at how we can report on some of this information. But before I get into that, I just want to quickly stop and just think about what we all think about at the start of all IT projects, particularly around data and integration. So obviously we want to move through our project quickly. We want to be adaptable because we don't always know all the requirements up front. We want a quality product, and we also want that to last. But while we're thinking about that, the project's going to fit into a larger picture, right? So part of our overall architecture. And I guess the background of Delta Mesh architecture is looking at how we can fulfill these four key points. But the idea of this video is to get more hands-on. So this company that we're talking about, let's just say they run pretty much their entire business through Salesforce. And let's say they're a reasonable size company. They do a lot of national and international travel. And they like to look after their employees and they like to get a good deal, but they really want to be able to have their flight management or corporate travel team being able to work out of Salesforce. So one of the first things they're going to need is the actual flight options, and maybe they might have some corporate rates or some special discounts and so on. So let's just say that they need to pull that from the Amadeus API, for example. At this particular API, you can get just about any flight anywhere in the world, huge amounts of data, far too much that would be practical to put into Salesforce. So we really need to narrow down what we need. And the easiest way to do that would be to come into Salesforce and just have an easy way of picking the city pairs. So let's jump over and have a quick look in Salesforce, what they've got going on there. So I guess the staff are able to come in and add these city pairs. I can say the from city, the to city, the max number of stops. So if you know that there is a shorter flight, then you may as well just get those flights. You don't need to get unnecessary flights in, and maybe there's a number of days out. So we just essentially need the corporate travel staff to have a really easy way of saying like what information they want to see in Salesforce. And the other thing that the company is looking to set up is a really nice travel reporting. May just want to have a really easy way to give the corporate travel staff visibility of what's going on, but without necessarily having to sync all that data back into Salesforce. So they just want to jump into Power BI. And also the report developers aren't necessarily Salesforce developers. So this is basically how we would lay this out in Delta Mesh architecture. So we've got the Amadeus API in there, and we've got a nexus in here that's going to allow us to communicate between that API and communicate to our Delta Mesh domain. We've got Salesforce in its own apron. And if you recall from the other video, you can just think of this like a piece of concrete. So it's we can put whatever in here, just hopefully what makes sense. And again, we've got a nexus, and then we've got our Delta Mesh domain, and we've got our travel analytics domains. This is where we're going to do our reporting. So Microsoft Fabric's broken up into workspaces, which if you're familiar with Azure, you can think of them in a similar way to what you would resource groups. We've already defined our basic architecture. So now we've created a workspace to match each one. So we've got Delta Mesh, which is sort of a standard one, flight data, the Salesforce, and of course our reporting domain. When you hit this Amadeus API, as I was saying earlier, you really need to be specific, right? It can't just give you all information of all time. So when we come to do that, we're going to need to know what city pairs are interesting. So let's look at how we would do that. So we go to our Salesforce workspace, and in this case, we're just going to use a copy operation. And just as a reminder, within an apron, according to the architecture, you're actually free to do pretty much whatever you want. The output needs to go to an appropriate raw location within your Delta Mesh architecture. So we've got the copy operation using the Fabric connector, and this is a pipeline operation. And it's just going to connect to the custom object in Salesforce and write it directly to our raw layer as a Delta table. So if we just jump over to our Delta Mesh workspace, we can see the Salesforce raw lakehouse, and we can see that the data is coming into a new Delta Lake table. Once we've got our raw data available, we don't have to think about the Amadeus API. We can just jump over to our Delta Mesh domain and say, well, we've got raw data. That's great. but now we need to get it into our data hub. And I'm just showing the output here of the notebook. In a later video, I'll actually go in depth into notebooks and how these ones in particular were put together. But this video is more of a general overview of how you would implement this architecture in this scenario in Microsoft Fabric. The next thing for us to do is to go to the Amadeus API and pull back the travel options that we want to later sync to Salesforce. And we want to use the city pairs that we've got in our data hub to know what to request. All right, so we're in the flight data workspace and we've just arranged it sort of a bit neatly into folders. Here's where we shortcut Delta Mesh domain tables. It's nicer for namespacing and it just ensures that all compute is managed by this particular workspace. So we'll go to inbound. In this case, I've only got one inbound stream and that's flight options, but this could be an unlimited number, like whatever the company actually needs. This is going to be the place where we're going to put it. And as I mentioned before, within an apron, or in this case, within a workspace, we are actually free to do whatever we think is the most appropriate thing. The proviso is that we just provide raw data in a appropriate standard. I've just used a pipeline activity here in this case, and it looks a little bit busy, but let's just go through. So we can see here, it's just going to grab an auth token to the API. So that's going to make a call, and we're just setting a variable here as well. So this is probably the first interesting part. So what we're doing is looking up the city pair. So we're able to just do a select statement. So that's going to give us our city pairs. And then if you're familiar with how pipeline activities work in Fabric, we've now got an array. So we can do a for each on that array. And as an extra note as well, we do have full control over how many parallel requests we're going to do. And we can rate limit it to do all sorts of things. In this case, we're only using the test API, so we're keeping it pretty simple. And if we go with inside this for each, so the first thing we're doing in here is just setting the endpoint. So it's a RESTful API, so we can just, for each city pair, we can just dynamically set what we're going to be fetching. And I will make all this available for download, so just look in the description and you can grab it off GitHub. So we can see we've got the query that we've just set, and then we're just going to write it to a temporary location. So let's jump over and have a look at that temporary data. So we've got a top level folder for the pipeline. And if we go in there, we're just dynamically creating a subfolder for the data, the flights that we're fetching and the run ID. And if we go in there, we can see these are just individual JSON files that contain what was returned from the API. So we can actually just go in and immediately browse those. So if we come back to our pipeline, so what we're doing is, let's just zoom out a little bit. We're just iterating through that list and writing it to a temporary table. And once we've got all that data, we're just going to pick it all up and write it to our raw Delta Lake table. So let's just jump over and have a quick look. So we're going to go over to Delta Mesh. We're going to go to our raw lake houses and we're going to go to our flight data. So here's all our flight options. And each row in here is what came back from each API call. So, and we've got a little bit of metadata. We can see what was the subquery, we can see the date and so on. And we just keep all that information in raw. So this is append only. And now that we've got all that data in raw, the next thing we can do is jump over and do our raw to curated. And we've done that here in a very similar way to what we did for the city pair data. And this is what the data looks like in our curated table. So the next thing for us to do, which is a separate operation and I expect would be done by the Salesforce team, is to pick up this flight options data and get it back into our Salesforce domain. So then we can have business processes running inside Salesforce that allow the corporate flight travel team to organize flights and lock them in for staff. One of the advantages of the Delta Mesh architecture is that the Salesforce team, in this case, doesn't have to know about the Amadeus API or deal with the raw to curated or any of that complexity. They can just come in and look at the clean data and set up operations to bring that into custom objects within Salesforce. So let's jump over to the Salesforce workspace. And here we've set up a copy operation. And another good thing to remember about the Delta Mesh architecture is when we bring data in centrally, while we usually have a first use case for it, the idea is that we don't have an opinion on that data and we keep it as broad as possible. So when we bring the flight options information into Salesforce, we're probably going to want to filter that a little bit and do a few things. we've also got to remember that that data may also be used in reports, and it may also be synced to other systems later on. So we don't want to limit it too much when we're creating those curated tables. So here we're in the Salesforce workspace. We've set up a copy operation. We've got some SQL filters going on, and that information is just going to then sync into Salesforce. And this is what it looks like once you jump over to Salesforce. You can see all the data that's come back. And so the algorithms inside Salesforce would be able to figure out, based on what flights are available, which one to pick. And then that flight information would be captured in Salesforce. And the next thing is we actually want to bring that back in the same way. So we, from Salesforce to Raw, and we curate it. So now we've got centrally which flights our staff are actually on. And then that can be used for reporting. So you might have a report that shows which staff are currently traveling and so on. So over now, looking at our travel analytics domain, this is, again, probably a separate team. And they're able to just look at the pure tables. They don't need to understand Salesforce. They don't need to understand Amadeus or anything else. They've just got nice, clean tables to look at. And something that we recommend is that they create a lakehouse locally. So it's essentially somewhere for them to put shortcuts from the central data hub. So that way they don't have to have all the tables and compute anything that they do, like report refreshes and so on. That's going to be running on the capacity that's assigned to their workspace. So you can share them, obviously, but if you're finding problems with loads, or you just want to be able to allocate budgets and so on, you can do that separately. And this is what that looks like. So we've called the local lakehouse hub travel. So, and we've added in shortcuts to those central tables. So I've created a basic report here, but the key thing to remember is that the reporting devs or whoever's working on your reports really is able to work independently. And also, if at some point the travel API needed to be changed, the Salesforce team and the report devs and anyone else would be sort of shielded from that. So you could have a separate team go and figure out, all the new endpoints, bring that data back into a new raw information. Then you would curate that into the same tables that we've currently been working with. And then that would happily sync to Salesforce. The data would come back, and it would be available for reporting. And that really helps us to keep the work and the cost associated with where the change is, and not have this deep coupling all over the organization. That was a quick introduction to using Delta Mesh architecture within Fabric and working with a hypothetical corporate travel situation. So I hope you found that helpful. If you'd like access to the source code and some of the exports from Fabric, we'll be putting those up on our GitHub and linking to them below. The only exception to that is the notebooks, which they will be in our upcoming video. And we'll also be introducing a new open source Python library that will make it easier to work with the Delta Mesh architecture and maintain data engineering best practice. This is part of an ongoing series on the Delta Mesh architecture. So if you'd like to hear more, please subscribe and say hello anytime on LinkedIn. Thank you.